The storm and the three boys. The rain pelted the ground with increasing fury, as if the sky itself was trying to wash away the city's sins. Beneath the flickering streetlight, the three boys huddled together, shielding themselves from the worst of the downpour with what little they had. The alley where they took refuge was dark, damp, and smelly, filled with discarded cardboard boxes and old newspapers. It wasn't the place they had chosen, but it was the only place they could be. Jordan, the eldest of the three, took a deep breath, as if trying to breathe through the stench of the alley and the uncertainty that weighed down on him. His eyes were tired, shadowed with the fatigue of a life lived in constant survival mode. At just 14, his childhood had already been stolen from him. A series of foster homes and broken promises had made him an expert in navigating a world that often seemed indifferent to his existence. Beside him, Malik shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his oversized jacket, trying to keep his fingers warm. His eyes, usually full of mischief, were now clouded with worry. He had always been the one to joke and laugh, to try and lighten the mood, but tonight, even his infectious energy couldn't mask the sense of dread that gnawed at him. The storm wasn't the only thing that was relentless, it was the hunger that clawed at his stomach, the gnawing emptiness that had become his constant companion. Carlos, the youngest of the three, crouched near the ground, pulling his knees close to his chest for warmth. His face was pale, and his lips were dry, cracked from the lack of food and water. His body shivered not just from the cold, but from fear. Fear that they would never find a way out of this mess, that the future would always be this uncertain, always this harsh. He had been quiet since the rain had started, too tired to speak and too defeated to ask for help anymore. They had tried to go to shelters, but each time, they were turned away. Some said they were too young to be on the streets, others simply ignored their pleas, pretending not to see them. Each rejection was another sting to their pride, another blow to their hope. What were they supposed to do? Every street corner, every alley, every empty park bench felt like a dead end. There were no answers for them, only survival. "I hate this," Malik muttered under his breath. His voice barely carried over the sound of the rain, but the frustration was evident in his tone. Why can't things just be different? Jordan shifted uncomfortably, looking up and down the alley, as if expecting someone to appear, as if someone might walk by and offer them a way out. But no one ever did. "Things aren't gonna change, Malik. Not for us. We have to do what we have to do to survive." His voice was hard, resigned. "That's the way it is." The coldness of his words settled in the air like the mist that clung to everything in the alley. Carlos, too young to fully grasp the reality of their situation, only knew that his friends had become like family to him. They had to survive together. If one of them fell, they all did. He didn't understand the world that kept pushing them down, but he felt it in his bones, the unyielding pressure of it all. The sound of a car passing by broke through the quiet tension. The vehicle's headlights illuminated the wet pavement for a moment, casting eerie shadows across the alley before it sped away, leaving the boys in the cold darkness once more. There was no one else around, no one to see them, no one to help them. "I'm hungry, man," Malik said quietly, staring at the ground. His stomach growled loudly, but it wasn't just hunger he was feeling, it was a profound sense of loss. Hunger, he had learned, wasn't just about food. It was about the absence of something more: love, care, security. "I know," Jordan said softly. He didn't need to ask if his friends were hungry, it was the same for all of them. It had been days since their last proper meal, and the hunger was starting to feel like it was eating away at their very souls. Carlos pulled his legs closer to his chest, pressing his forehead against his knees, trying to shut out the gnawing emptiness. The storm outside matched the storm inside him, he couldn't remember when he'd last felt safe or full. He was too young to carry such burdens, yet here he was, just another child abandoned by the system, forced to fend for himself on a cold, rainy night. But as the minutes passed, a faint flicker of light appeared at the far end of the alley. A figure was moving slowly toward them, seemingly out of place in the dark, rainy street. The boys stiffened instinctively, not sure whether to expect help or hostility. It was a woman. She walked with a purposeful stride, her umbrella held high over her head to shield herself from the rain. She wore a long coat that swayed gently as she walked, and her face was partially obscured by a scarf. As she neared, the boys could see the faint glow of warmth in her eyes, the kind of warmth that didn't come from a facade, but from something deeper, something that caught their attention, despite their initial wariness. When she reached them, she stopped for a moment, her gaze flickering between the three boys. She didn't seem alarmed by their presence or put off by the sight of their ragged clothes. Instead, her eyes softened. "You all look like you could use some help," she said, her voice calm but filled with an empathy that surprised them. Jordan, ever the protector, took a cautious step forward, his posture stiff. "We're fine. We're just waiting for the rain to stop." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying his answer. "Waiting for the rain to stop, huh? It's not gonna stop anytime soon. You look like you haven't eaten in days." There was a long pause, and for a moment, none of the boys knew how to respond. They had been so used to hiding the truth, to pretending everything was fine, that they almost didn't know how to admit that they were hungry, truly hungry. We're okay," Malik said, though the lie sounded hollow even to him. She smiled, a faint and understanding smile. "Listen, I'm not here to judge. I know what it's like to be hungry. You don't need to pretend. Come inside with me. I can get you something warm." The offer was simple, yet it felt monumental. The boys glanced at each other, exchanging uncertain looks. They had been turned away by so many before. What was different about this woman? What did she expect in return? They had learned to question the motives of anyone who offered them kindness. It was rare, and it often came with strings attached. But something about her, maybe it was the way she didn't look at them with pity, but with understanding, made them reconsider. Maybe this time, they could trust her. Maybe they could take a risk, just for once. "Come on," she said, noticing their hesitation. "You can't stay out here in the rain all night. There's a place not far from here. Warm food. A place to sit. Just for a little while. I won't ask for anything in return." Jordan, after a long pause, finally nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Okay. We'll go with you." And just like that, with no further words spoken, the boys followed her, their tired steps falling in sync with hers as they moved toward the warmth of whatever awaited them. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, the weight in their hearts lightened, even if only for a brief moment. The kindness of a stranger had opened a door they hadn't even known existed. And as they walked through the rain-soaked streets, they realized that sometimes, all it took was one person to change everything, just one person who saw them, who cared enough to offer more than just a glance, more than just an empty promise. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start a new chapter in their story. The unexpected kindness. The sound of the rain grew louder as they walked, the heavy drops splattering against the pavement in rhythmic bursts, almost as though they were marking the passage of time. The woman led them with a quiet confidence, her pace steady despite the downpour. Her umbrella swayed gently above her head, casting a faint circle of protection from the storm. The boys followed closely behind her, hesitant but curious, unsure of what to expect next. Jordan kept glancing around, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows, always on the lookout for danger. He had lived in this city long enough to know that people didn't help for free. There was always something expected in return, something that couldn't be avoided. So why was she helping them now? The doubt gnawed at him, but he had to admit that there was something different about this woman. She didn't seem like the others who had walked past them in the past. Ignoring their pleas, looking the other way. This woman had stopped, offered them a chance, and had spoken to them like they were human beings. Malik, still skeptical but slightly more at ease than Jordan, looked up at the darkened sky, watching the rain fall like a curtain. "You think she's for real?" he muttered under his breath. "Maybe she's just being nice because she feels sorry for us." Jordan didn't answer right away. His mind was busy calculating, analyzing, and weighing the risk. But something inside him, a small flicker of hope, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this time it was different. "I don't know, Malik. I don't think so. She's not acting like everyone else." Carlos, the youngest, tugged at the sleeve of Malik's jacket. His face was a mixture of exhaustion and hope, and though he didn't fully understand the implications of their situation, he could sense that this was an important moment. He had learned enough in his short life to recognize when someone was giving them an opportunity. "I think she's just helping," he said quietly, his voice carrying the innocence that the others had lost long ago. Malik shrugged, the weight of their collective uncertainty hanging on his shoulders. "Guess we'll find out." They continued walking, their shoes splashing through puddles, until they reached a small, unassuming building nestled between a pair of tall, dark buildings. The sign above the door read Jasper's Cafe, but the fading paint and worn edges of the letters made it seem like it had been there for a long time, waiting for a new chapter. The woman stopped at the door, glancing over her shoulder to make sure they were still with her. "Here we are," she said, her voice warm but firm. "It's not much, but it'll be enough for tonight." The boys hesitated for just a moment, still unsure about walking inside. They had become experts at reading the atmosphere of a place, whether it was safe or dangerous, whether they would be welcomed or shooed away. But there was something in the way she held herself, the kindness in her eyes, that made them want to trust her. And for a brief second, they could almost forget the pain of their hunger, their isolation, and the storm that raged outside. The woman pushed the door open and stepped inside. A bell above the door jingled as it swung wide, and the faint smell of warm bread and fresh coffee wafted out, mingling with the damp scent of the rain-soaked streets. The cozy atmosphere inside the cafe was a stark contrast to the grim reality of the alley they had just left behind. Soft lighting illuminated the rustic wooden tables, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. It was a place that seemed to offer refuge, a sanctuary from the harshness of the world outside. "Come on in," the woman said, her voice gentle but insistent. "Sit down. I'll get you something to eat." They stepped cautiously over the threshold, the warmth of the cafe enveloping them like a soft blanket. It was the first time in weeks that any of them had felt something that resembled comfort. The tables were simple, and there was a small bar near the back where a few people sat, sipping on their drinks. The overall vibe was casual, relaxed, but there was something about the space that felt welcoming. Rachel, the woman who had led them inside, walked over to the counter where an older man with glasses stood behind it, polishing a glass. He looked up at her and raised an eyebrow in silent inquiry. "Jasper, can you make something warm for these boys?" Rachel asked. "They've been out in the rain for too long." Jasper, the cafe owner, glanced over at the boys and smiled, though there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "Of course, Rachel. What do they want?" Rachel turned to the boys, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter. "What can I get you?" "Anything you want. Don't worry about the cost." She paused, looking at their expressions, knowing that asking for what they wanted was more than just about food, it was about dignity, about giving them the power to choose. Jordan, always the cautious one, exchanged a quick look with Malik. "We just want something to fill us up," he said. "Maybe some soup. A sandwich if you have it. Anything that's warm." Carlos, who had been quiet for the entire walk, spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "A hot chocolate. Please." Rachel nodded, a soft smile tugging at her lips. She turned back to Jasper, who nodded in return, already pulling ingredients from beneath the counter. "You boys just take a seat," she said, gently guiding them toward a small table near the window. I'll bring it to you. They sat down, and for the first time in what felt like ages, the boys were silent. The noise of the cafe seemed to soften around them, and the warmth of the room seeped into their bones. They looked at each other, unsure of what to say. None of them had ever experienced kindness like this before, at least not without strings attached, not without judgment. Here, there was no expectation, no conditions, no reminder of their failures. Carlos stared out the window, watching the rain fall in sheets against the glass. His stomach rumbled loudly, but it wasn't just from hunger, he felt something else stirring within him. Hope, maybe. Or something close to it. He wasn't sure what to call it, but he hadn't felt it in a long time. The minutes seemed to stretch on, each one bringing them closer to something they couldn't yet fully understand. Rachel returned soon after with steaming bowls of soup, a pile of freshly made sandwiches, and the warm, rich smell of hot chocolate. She set the food down on the table before them with a careful hand. "There you go," she said, her voice soft. "Take your time." For a moment, none of the boys moved. The smell of the food, the warmth of the cafe, and the kindness in Rachel's eyes all seemed too much to process. They had almost forgotten what it felt like to eat when they weren't on the run, when they weren't worrying about where their next meal would come from. Then, slowly, almost tentatively, Jordan picked up his spoon. Malik followed suit, and Carlos, after a brief hesitation, took a sip of the hot chocolate. The first taste was like nothing they had ever experienced. It was simple, but it felt like a lifeline, a moment of grace in a world that had shown them so little. They didn't talk as they ate, but there didn't need to be words. For the first time in a long time, they didn't have to ask for anything. They didn't have to beg. They could just be. The bonds that form. The warmth of the cafe seemed to wrap itself around the boys like a protective cloak. The smell of freshly baked bread, the rich aroma of coffee, and the scent of hot soup filled the air, creating a comforting atmosphere that they had almost forgotten existed. It was a strange feeling, peace. A peace that didn't require them to fight for it, or work for it, or hide from it. It was simply there, something they could step into without fear or hesitation. The three boys sat around the small table, their eyes focused on their bowls and cups as if they feared that the moment they looked up, it might vanish. The warmth of the food in their bellies was a welcome relief, but it was the comfort of the space, the simple act of being allowed to sit, to eat without worrying about being chased off, that made them feel a little less invisible. Jordan, ever the cautious one, took the longest to let go of his wariness. He had spent so much of his life learning to survive that even a small act of kindness felt like a risk. But as the heat from the soup spread through him, he allowed himself to relax just a little. His grip on his spoon loosened, and he let himself savor the food, the first real meal he had in days. Malik, who had always been more open and optimistic than Jordan, was the first to break the silence. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes twinkling with mischief as he glanced at his friends. "Man, this soup tastes like heaven. I forgot food could taste this good." Carlos, who had been the quietest of the three, slowly nodded in agreement. His eyes were wide as he took another sip of his hot chocolate, letting the warmth spread through him. He wasn't used to this kind of luxury, sitting in a clean space, eating food that didn't taste like cardboard or scraps from a dumpster. He didn't know what to say, but his eyes shone with gratitude. Rachel, who had been watching them from a distance, now approached the table again. She stood there for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, watching the boys as they ate. There was something tender in her gaze, something that spoke of compassion but also strength. She had seen a lot in her years, and yet, there was something about these boys, about their resilience, that stirred something deep inside her. "I'm glad you like it," she said softly, her voice gentle but with a certain determination. "I know it's not much, but it's what I can offer right now." Jordan looked up at her, and for the first time since they had met, he met her gaze directly. His expression was still cautious, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something vulnerable, something he didn't often let anyone see. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "You don't even know us." Rachel smiled, though there was a tinge of sadness in her expression. "I know. But sometimes, people just need a little help. Sometimes, the world is so focused on what people don't have, that they forget to see what they do. You three, you remind me of the things I used to forget about." The words hung in the air for a moment, and the boys were silent as they absorbed them. There was no rush to speak, no urgency to fill the space with words. It was as if, for just a moment, they could let the world around them fall away, and they could just exist without judgment, without expectation. Jasper, who had been quietly tending to the counter, came over with a pot of fresh coffee and placed it on the table. He poured a cup for Rachel before turning to the boys. His demeanor was less familiar with them, but there was an undeniable warmth in his voice. "I'm glad you're enjoying the food. Rachel doesn't usually let people sit around here without a good reason. So, you must be something special." Malik laughed, his voice light. "Special? We're just a bunch of hungry kids who don't know where else to go." Jasper nodded slowly, as though processing the truth behind Malik's words. "I see. But even so, you deserve more than just scraps. People who are hungry, whether it's for food, love, or a place to belong, don't get the help they need very often. So when someone is willing to give it, it's important to recognize that." There was a quiet pause before Carlos finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but his words were clear. "Thank you." It was the first time any of them had truly said those words since they had met Rachel. Gratitude wasn't something they had felt comfortable expressing for a long time, not when everything they had known in the past had been conditional. But something about this moment, about the kindness that Rachel and Jasper were offering, made it feel right. Rachel smiled again, this time more warmly, and she pulled up a chair to sit with them. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "I'm just doing what feels right. But you should know, I've been where you are. Not in the same way, maybe. But I know what it feels like to need someone, to be alone, to wonder if anyone sees you. So, I see you. I see all of you." Jordan swallowed hard. There was something in Rachel's words that stirred a deep ache in his chest, a reminder of all the times he had felt unseen, forgotten, discarded. But there was also something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was the beginning of a crack in the armor he had built around his heart, a small shift towards something softer, something more hopeful. "So, what happens next?" Malik asked, breaking the silence that had fallen over the table. He looked up at Rachel with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "You've given us food, but we don't want to take advantage of you." Rachel chuckled softly, her eyes glinting with a quiet understanding. "You're not taking advantage. This isn't about that. What happens next is that you get to decide. You can stay here for as long as you need. You can get some rest. You can figure out where you want to go from here. But know this, you don't have to be alone. Not unless you want to be." Her words hung in the air, a promise wrapped in kindness, a lifeline in the form of an open door. It was a rare thing, something they had never truly known. People had passed them by, offering nothing more than cold indifference, or worse, dismissing them entirely. But here, in this warm cafe, with the sound of rain tapping against the windows, they were seen. And for the first time in what felt like forever, they didn't have to keep pretending they were fine when they weren't. They didn't have to keep hiding their hunger, their fear, their pain. Jordan, Malik, and Carlos exchanged a look. The weight of Rachel's words was sinking in, and each of them processed it in their own way. Jordan felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, hope. He didn't know what would come of this offer, or if it would lead anywhere, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was in this fight alone. Maybe, just maybe, there were people who could see beyond their circumstances, who could see them as more than just the sum of their struggles. "I guess we stay here for a while," Jordan said finally, his voice steady. "We'll figure things out." Malik grinned, the first real smile in a long time. "I can't argue with that." Carlos nodded, his small hands wrapping around his cup of hot chocolate. "I think I'd like that." Rachel looked at them with a gentle smile, and for the first time in a long time, the boys allowed themselves to believe in something bigger than survival. It wasn't a perfect solution. They didn't have all the answers. But it was a start. It was a chance. And sometimes, that's all it takes. A chance to begin again the path to belonging. As the days passed, the boys began to settle into a routine that felt both foreign and comforting. They were no longer just surviving, they were living. Rachel and Jasper didn't ask for anything in return for their kindness. Instead, they allowed the boys to simply exist within the walls of the cafe. The warmth of the space, the smells of freshly baked bread and brewed coffee, and the genuine smiles that greeted them each morning became a sanctuary from the cold and harshness of the streets. For the first time in months, the boys could focus on more than just hunger or fear. Jordan, Malik, and Carlos spent their mornings in the cafe, watching the world outside through the foggy windows, while Rachel and Jasper worked behind the counter. Sometimes Rachel would sit with them, talking about her life, asking them about their pasts, and slowly breaking down the walls they had carefully built around themselves. Her questions were never invasive, they were gentle, and over time, they began to share pieces of themselves, pieces they had never dared to expose to anyone else. Jordan, the most guarded of the three, took longer to open up. He was used to living in silence, moving through the world unnoticed, keeping his thoughts to himself. He had learned to distrust people who offered help without expecting something in return. But Rachel's presence was different. She wasn't asking for anything from them, not even a promise of gratitude. She simply wanted to know them, to understand their struggles without judgment. Slowly, Jordan began to trust her, and when he spoke, his voice held a mixture of raw honesty and reluctant hope. "I used to have a family," Jordan confided one evening, after the cafe had quieted down and only a few patrons remained sipping their drinks. His words were slow, measured, as though he were testing the weight of his own memories. "I had a mom, but she left when I was little. My dad, he wasn't around much. Not after he started drinking. He'd disappear for days sometimes. I had to take care of my little brother, Malik. And when he wasn't around, I had to take care of Carlos." He looked down at the table, as if the words were too heavy to carry on his own. Rachel sat quietly across from him, waiting for him to continue, her eyes soft with understanding. She didn't press him for more details. She knew that for Jordan, sharing a piece of his past was a monumental step. "You don't have to explain it all," Rachel said gently. "I can see it in your eyes, Jordan. You've had to carry a lot. And sometimes, the weight of it all can make you feel like you're sinking, like you're invisible to everyone around you." Jordan nodded, his throat tightening. He was unaccustomed to being understood. Unaccustomed to anyone seeing him for who he was, rather than what his life had become. He had always worn the mask of indifference, pushing away anyone who might get too close. But Rachel's quiet compassion made him feel as though maybe he didn't have to be so strong all the time. Across the table, Malik leaned forward, his eyes bright with curiosity. "We've been through a lot together," he said, his voice light, almost teasing, as he looked at Jordan. "But this place is different. We're not just running anymore. We have a chance, right?" Carlos, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, looked up from his mug of hot chocolate and smiled. "I like it here. I feel like we belong." The words hung in the air for a moment, and even Jordan, who had always been the skeptic, couldn't deny the truth in them. They weren't just surviving in the cafe. They were beginning to belong. To something greater than themselves. to each other. But just as they were starting to feel the weight of hope settle into their bones, the outside world began to intrude. One afternoon, as the boys sat at their usual table, enjoying a quiet moment, the door to the cafe swung open with a sharp jingle. A group of young men, loud, confident, and dressed in flashy clothes, walked in, their presence immediately filling the space with tension. Rachel was behind the counter, but her eyes narrowed when she saw them. Jasper, who had been busy wiping down a glass, stiffened but said nothing. The group of young men walked to the counter, exchanging loud jokes and boasting with one another. They ignored the boys sitting at the table, but there was a palpable sense of discomfort in the air. It wasn't that the boys felt threatened, they had seen enough hostility in their lives to know how to avoid trouble, but it was the underlying feeling of being an outsider that made them uneasy. They had never been welcomed into places like this before. One of the men, a tall figure with a wide grin, caught sight of the boys and made a beeline toward their table. Jordan's stomach clenched, his body tensing instinctively. But the man's expression wasn't filled with malice, just curiosity, as if he were sizing them up. Well, the man said, standing in front of their table. Look at you three, sitting here like you belong. You don't look like the usual crowd. He glanced over his shoulder at his friends, who were laughing and chatting loudly at the counter. Rachel, you let them stay here? Don't tell me you've got a soft spot for these street rats. The words hit the boys like a slap to the face, but they remained silent, trying not to show any reaction. They had learned long ago not to engage with people who didn't see their worth. Rachel, who had been observing the exchange from behind the counter, stepped forward. Watch your mouth, Greg, she said, her voice calm but firm. These boys are guests here, and they're welcome as long as they want to stay. You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't. Greg's grin faltered for a moment as he looked from Rachel to the boys, then back at his friends. The air in the cafe shifted, and for a brief moment, the boys wondered if this would be the end of their brief respite. Would Rachel stand up for them, or would the pressure of her customers force her to choose sides? But Rachel stood her ground. She met Greg's gaze with unwavering confidence, her posture straight and unyielding. You don't get to come in here and make anyone feel less than they are. These boys are as much a part of this cafe as anyone else. You can either respect that, or you can leave. For a moment, there was silence. The group of men at the counter seemed to weigh the situation, unsure of how to respond. Greg looked at Rachel, his bravado faltering. It wasn't often that someone challenged him like this, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. Finally, he let out a huff of air, his smile returning. All right. I get it. We're all friends here. He turned back to his group, shrugging. Let's grab our drinks and get out of here. I don't want to ruin the mood. As the group of men filed out, the boys sat in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. It wasn't just Rachel's words that had protected them, it was her conviction, her refusal to let anyone make them feel less than human. For the first time, the boys felt a small flicker of pride. They were no longer just guests in this space, they were part of it. Carlos was the first to break the silence. She didn't let him talk down to us. She didn't let him make us feel like we didn't belong. Malik's eyes were wide with admiration. I can't believe she did that. I mean, she didn't even hesitate. Jordan nodded slowly, his eyes on Rachel as she returned to the counter. There was something in his chest, something warm and unfamiliar, beginning to stir. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to belong. Not just in the cafe, but in a world that had often made them feel like they were invisible. Rachel caught Jordan's gaze and smiled softly, as though she understood exactly what he was feeling. She didn't say anything, but there was no need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than any words could. The boys sat back in their seats, the weight of the moment sinking in. For the first time, they weren't just surviving. They were part of something bigger. They were part of a place that saw them, that valued them. And that meant everything. The awakening of hope. In the weeks that followed, the cafe became more than just a refuge for Jordan, Malik, and Carlos. It became a place of transformation, where the boundaries of their lives began to stretch beyond mere survival. Rachel and Jasper continued to offer them a safe space, but they also began to encourage them to think about what came next. It was a slow process, one that was filled with both small victories and setbacks, but with every passing day, the boys began to see that their lives could hold more than just the harsh reality they had known. Malik, ever the optimist, was the first to ask Rachel for more. One afternoon, as they sat together in the quiet of the cafe, he looked up from his cup of tea and met Rachel's gaze. "You know, Rachel," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking. You've been really good to us, and we've gotten so much already. But I don't want to just stay here forever. I don't want to be the kind of person who just takes, and never gives anything back." Rachel smiled warmly at him, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. "I'm glad to hear you say that, Malik. But remember, it's not about giving back to me. It's about finding what you want to give to the world, and to yourselves. You don't have to have all the answers yet, but you can start thinking about them. What do you want to do with your lives?" Malik's eyes shone with the spark of ambition. He had always dreamed of something bigger than the life he had been handed. "I don't know exactly," he said slowly, "but I think I want to help people. I've seen what it's like to have nothing. To feel like you're invisible. And I don't want other people to feel that way. Maybe I could help out in places like this one, help others who are struggling." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with approval. "That's a good start, Malik. You're already on the path to something greater. But the most important thing you need to remember is that no matter where you start, you can always change your course. No one is ever stuck in one place unless they choose to be." Carlos, who had been listening quietly, spoke up then. "But Rachel, what if we don't know where to start? What if we don't know what we're good at?" Rachel leaned forward, her expression gentle but encouraging. "You start by believing in yourselves. By trying things out, failing, and trying again. The world won't always be kind, and it won't always be fair. But you have a right to dream, to chase after something better. The first step is to stop letting the past define your future." Jordan, who had been quiet up until this point, nodded slowly. He had spent years living in the shadows, trying to outrun his past, trying to survive in a world that seemed to want nothing more than to break him. But Rachel's words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time in his life, he began to wonder if he could start over. If he could be more than just the product of his circumstances. "Maybe I can learn something," he said, his voice uncertain but tinged with a flicker of hope. "I've always been good with my hands, fixing things, building things. But I never really thought I could make a living doing it. I always thought I'd just end up like the rest of them." Rachel's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "Don't sell yourself short, Jordan. Just because something is hard doesn't mean it's impossible. You have the skills. You just need to believe in them. And don't let anyone tell you that you're too young, too broken, or too different to make something of yourself." Jordan's heart swelled with the weight of her words, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that he wasn't doomed to repeat the cycle of hardship he had always known. Maybe, just maybe, there was something more for him out there. The next few weeks were a blur of new beginnings. Rachel and Jasper continued to offer the boys a safe space to heal, but they also encouraged them to take small steps toward their goals. Malik began volunteering at local shelters, helping to organize food drives and support services for those who were homeless. He found joy in connecting with others, in offering the same kindness and care that had been extended to him. He began to feel like he was building something, not just a future for himself, but a future for others who had been where he once was. Carlos, who had always been quiet and introspective, began to take an interest in art. It started with a few sketches he drew during the quieter moments in the cafe, and soon, Rachel noticed his talent. She encouraged him to try painting, to use his art as a way of expressing himself. Carlos didn't need much encouragement. He poured his heart into his work, using colors and shapes to tell the story of his life, the pain, the hope, the resilience. His paintings became a window into his soul, and slowly, they began to draw the attention of others. Jordan, still uncertain of his future, began taking small steps toward learning a trade. He spent his afternoons volunteering with a local carpenter, learning the basics of woodworking and construction. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him a sense of pride. He had spent so many years thinking that his only worth was in how well he could fight for survival, but now, he was learning that his value could come from the things he built with his own two hands. Rachel and Jasper watched with quiet pride as the boys took their first steps toward their new lives. They had become something more than the ragged, hungry children who had first walked into the cafe. They had become young men with dreams, with ambition, and with the courage to face whatever the world threw their way. But even as they began to find their footing, the reality of their pasts still loomed large. Jordan, Malik, and Carlos had all experienced things that no child should have to endure. They had witnessed too much pain, too much loss, and too much injustice. And while they had begun to forge new paths for themselves, they knew that they couldn't outrun their pasts entirely. One evening, as the boys sat together after a long day of work, Malik spoke up. His voice was quieter than usual, and there was a vulnerability in his words that he hadn't allowed himself to express before. Sometimes, he said softly, I feel like I'm still the same kid I was back then. Like no matter how much I try, I can't shake it. I can't shake the feeling that I'll always be less than everyone else. Jordan, who had spent much of his life with that same feeling, turned to his friend. I get it, he said quietly. I've always felt like I'm not enough. Like I'm not worthy of a better life. But maybe we don't have to be perfect. Maybe we just have to be willing to try. Carlos, who had been quiet as always, nodded slowly. And maybe we don't have to do it alone. We've got each other. And we've got Rachel and Jasper. Malik's eyes brightened, a slow smile spreading across his face. Yeah. We've got something good here. And we don't have to let our pasts drag us down anymore. Rachel, who had been listening quietly from behind the counter, stepped forward. You're right, she said with a smile. You're not perfect. None of us are. But you're all worthy of happiness. Worthy of love. And worthy of finding your place in this world. The words resonated deeply with the boys. In that moment, they realized that they weren't just chasing a dream, they were already living it. They weren't defined by their pasts, nor by the things they had suffered. They were defined by the choices they made, by the courage to believe that things could be different, and by the unwavering support they gave each other. And for the first time in a long time, they felt the stirring of something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in years, hope. Real, lasting hope. A hope that would carry them forward, no matter what, the test of true change. The boys had come a long way in their journey, but as the days stretched into months, they soon discovered that change wasn't something that could be simply wished into existence. The world didn't just offer second chances on a silver platter. They had to fight for every piece of progress, every step forward, and sometimes even the smallest victories felt like an uphill battle. For Malik, the challenges were mostly internal. Volunteering at shelters had opened his eyes to the harsh realities that so many people faced. But it also made him question his place in this work. Was he really making a difference, or was he just another person trying to fill the void with good intentions? He felt pressure, the kind that weighed down his shoulders and made him second-guess his choices. Yet, every time he encountered someone who remembered his name, every time he saw the gratitude in their eyes, he was reminded why he had chosen this path. His hope and determination kept him going, even on the hardest days. Carlos, on the other hand, found peace in his art, but it didn't come without its struggles. There were times when he questioned the worth of his work. Was he just creating pieces to escape his past? Was there any real value to what he was doing, or was it all just an act of rebellion against the life he had been handed? Yet, when he saw people's reactions to his paintings, when he saw them pause and take in the emotion he had poured onto the canvas, it became clear. His art wasn't just for himself. It was for others to see the depth of what he had been through. And through it, they could see that there was more to him than just the life he had left behind. Jordan's path, though filled with fewer doubts, was equally difficult. His work as an apprentice carpenter was hard, physical labor that often left him exhausted at the end of the day. But it also gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. Each nail hammered, each beam cut precisely, each piece of wood shaped and molded into something new, it was all a reflection of the man he was becoming. He realized that his skill with his hands, something he had once thought was a simple way to survive, was now a key to his future. He wasn't just fixing things for other people anymore, he was building a life for himself, piece by piece. Yet, despite their individual growth, life continued to throw obstacles at them. Malik, who had been so dedicated to helping others, found himself facing a painful realization: the shelter where he had volunteered was struggling financially. They were running out of resources, and as much as he had tried to make a difference, the walls of bureaucracy and the overwhelming demands of the community seemed insurmountable. Malik often found himself questioning if his efforts were enough. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at the shelter, he found himself sitting alone at the cafe, staring into his empty cup. Rachel had noticed the change in him and took a moment to sit beside him, offering her silent support. "You seem off, Malik," she said softly, her voice a balm against his racing thoughts. "What's going on?" Malik hesitated, his eyes downcast. "It's hard, Rachel. I thought helping people would be enough, but it's not. The more I try to fix things, the more I realize how broken everything is. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. I don't know if any of us are." Rachel's gaze softened as she listened. She knew the weight of his words, knew that sometimes the burden of doing good could feel like it was too much to bear. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm yet compassionate. "You don't have to fix everything, Malik," she said gently. "You just need to keep doing what you can, even if it's only a little at a time. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen all at once. But every small act of kindness, every moment you give someone your time, that's what matters." Malik's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself feel the weight of the hope she had given him. It was true. He didn't need to save the world. He only needed to show up, to keep fighting for what he believed in, and to never give up on the people who needed him. Meanwhile, Carlos was facing his own trials. His art was beginning to gain some recognition, but it came at a price. He was asked to showcase his work at a local gallery, and while he was proud of his accomplishments, he felt a strange discomfort at the thought of others viewing his most intimate creations. His paintings told stories of pain, of loss, and of the darkness he had carried for so long. He had created them to process his own trauma, but now they were to be displayed for everyone to see. One night, as the gallery opening loomed closer, Carlos sat in the corner of the cafe, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of his latest painting. The lines and colors blurred in his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder, was he ready for this? Could he really put himself out there like that? Could he allow others to see the rawness of his soul without fear of judgment? Rachel, ever perceptive, noticed his unease and quietly took a seat beside him. "Carlos," she began, her voice calm but encouraging, "I see the way you look at your art. It's more than just a collection of colors and shapes. It's a reflection of who you are. And people will see that. They'll see the truth in it, and that's powerful. But you don't have to be afraid of it. You have every right to be proud of what you've created." Carlos met her gaze, his throat tight. He wasn't sure he believed in his own strength yet, but he trusted Rachel. What if they don't understand? What if they look at my art and just see the darkness, and not the fight to get out of it? Rachel smiled softly, her eyes warm. Sometimes people need to see the darkness before they can understand the light. You can't control how others perceive your art, but you can control how you stand behind it. Don't let fear hold you back, Carlos. You have a voice, and your art is how you choose to use it. Don't hide from it. Carlos nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding, to let the world see the parts of him that he had once kept hidden in the shadows. For Jordan, the reality of his future was both exciting and daunting. As he worked alongside his mentor, the carpenter, he found himself drawn to the challenge of building something more than just physical structures. He wanted to build a life that he could be proud of. But the fear of failure lingered like an ever-present shadow. What if he wasn't good enough? What if all of his efforts were in vain? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jordan stood alone in the cafe, looking out the window at the quiet streets. His thoughts were a jumble of doubts, but he could hear Rachel's voice echoing in his mind, "You're more than your past. You're more than the mistakes you've made. What matters is that you keep moving forward." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words. Maybe he didn't have all the answers yet. Maybe he didn't know exactly where he was headed, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. As the boys continued to push forward, they began to realize that true change was not something that could be measured by grand gestures or overnight success. It was something that came from within, an unwavering belief that they were worthy of more than the lives they had once known. It was the courage to face their fears, to acknowledge their weaknesses, and to still choose to move forward, one small step at a time. They were no longer the hungry, broken children who had wandered into the cafe all those months ago. They were becoming men who were learning to stand tall, who were beginning to see the possibility of a future that was brighter than the darkness of their pasts. And even though they knew there would always be obstacles, they also knew they had something more powerful than fear: they had each other. And they had the unwavering belief that, no matter how hard life got, they were capable of creating their own path to redemption. The future was theirs for the taking.